It's my honor to acknowledge the partners once again who have made IDS 2026 possible. Silver partner in Solutions Global, Spectrum Digital, and Flip Carbon. Bronze partner Hello.ai, Trip Gain, and Sai Krishna and Associates. With that, let's move ahead to our next session, a virtual address on who, what, how, and why, a primer on AI readiness. This is virtual address presented by Mr. Soumyajit Sarcar, Regional Data Officer, Chief Data Office, Nomura.
Future at heart when we move forward. Every time you share a meal with your friends, every time your hard work lights up your lives, every time the explorer in you chases experiences, we move forward together. We strive to create a more connected world where your smallest transaction becomes someone's opportunity. From the street vendor who can now accept payments through UPI to the grandmother who collects a pension through APS, each milestone is a life made easier. Through the speed of OTG, the accessibility of NFS, we are driving the world forward, one transaction at a time, or 14 billion transactions per month, to be honest. We are driven by the joy of a village going digital, the pride of a young entrepreneur closing their sale, the relief of helping our loved ones beyond borders. Your stories fuel our innovation. Our strength lies in innovation that adapts to over 150,000 UPI requests per second, inclusivity that empowers over 10.5 billion API requests per day. Our strength lies in the trust of our users, in the confidence of our power. Can you speak, sir?
Yeah, Deepak, can you hear me now? Perfect.
Yes, sir.
Please let me know once everything's set up on there.
Yes, sir. You may proceed.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen. I know it's difficult to do it remotely, so hopefully, everybody can hear me okay. We will try and leave some time towards the end for questions. Can somebody confirm that they're able to see my slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So a quick intro. My name is Soumyajit. I run the regional data office for Nomura. I'm based out of Singapore. Unfortunately, I could not be there in person due to other priorities. But again, thanks for having me and spending this time this afternoon to hear a little bit about how do you sort of advance your AI journey in your own organizations, right? Let me deep dive straight into it because we've got about 15 to 20 minutes. It is going to be a little bit of a cruise. Of course, there is no way I can do justice to the topic in 20 minutes, but I hope to, the intent here is to spark interest, to hopefully, address some of the burning questions, or at least provoke thought into how you can take this back into your own areas and, develop this further. All right, so we all data tech people here. We all believe in numbers, and I thought it'll be an interesting start to see if the numbers tell a story about AI journeys, right? So a lot of you who've been following the news would unmistakably have come across this. The MIT study last year, which said just 5% of AI pilots are extracting value or providing returns, right? And what that really means, when the media reported it, it was the 95% of AI pilots fail, right? That was how the news came about. It did sort of spark interest in terms of what does the industry do about it, what needs to be then addressed, and what's the story going forward. A few months later, actually on the first or the second week of January, the AI and Data Leadership Executive Benchmark Survey results came out. This has been a decade-long running survey, predominantly in the Western context, but about 500 plus samples from leading organizations, right? Which said 99.1% of companies that were surveyed had investment in AI and data as their priority, right? So yes, while things were not moving as much as people would have loved to, right, as much as organizations would have loved to, they were still faith in it, and therefore investments were seen to be growing significantly, right? Towards the end of last year, there was an announcement in Singapore. It was it did appear in the news. DBS, which is one of the biggest banks here locally and regionally, they have presence as well in other countries. It published news saying that they have unlocked $1 billion value in AI investments. Right. So to sum up, right, there are obviously organizations who are finding benefit, right? And the numbers also say there are others who are yet to find that, right? So there's a big opportunity that's out there for each and every one of you sitting in the room, including me. Right? So how do we then unpack this, right? What is working versus what is not working? So based on what we are doing here at Nomura and my conversations with the peers in different industry forums and informal conversations, a practical framework that essentially has worked, right? And I'll give an example as we go along, right? Is the recognition that AI is not about technology alone, right? In the early years, it was a lot focused on tech. The big techs came out with different models, with different services, and so on and so forth. Everybody was rushing towards it. There was a lot of adoption in your personal space, chat GPTs and perplexities and so on and so forth. But when it came to organizations, right, there was obviously a sense of unease, right, spoken or unspoken. We'll talk a little bit about each of these pillars in a moment, but broadly, if you had to take away one thing from this 20 minutes or 15 minutes, this is the slide I would want you to go back and reflect and build upon it in context of your own organizations. Right? The first and foremost, and essentially the way that this is laid down is sort of in an order of priority, although it may not be 100% sequential. Right? The first thing is you always start with the business case. You don't start with here's an AI technology, what can it do for me? You always start with where is my problem, right? This is not new. It's been said many, many times before, but it was proven yet again that we don't really follow what we say and learn from the past. But this is something that is really critical, right? So at the top of our house, we have defined the strategy, right? We have defined why we would use AI, where would we use AI, how far we would use AI, what's our risk appetite, and what we expect out of it, right? So it is basically laying the foundations to set realistic expectations, to then pave the path for your investments, to then understand whether those investments are actually on the track, on the right track, so that you can measure the value along the way. The second, then important part is once you've said, here's what I want to do, here's what I think we would be doing in 3 years, 5 years, whatever time frame you decide, right? And cautiously, I would say less than 3 years is highly ambitious, right? Given that it's a new tech, given that there's a lot of other components that needs to change alongside, in the AI journey. 3 to 5 year roadmap is really a practical one, right? Obviously, it doesn't mean that you have to wait for 3 years to get all your returns, but that's where you probably see things, more or less of a tipping point to see incremental value going on, right? And by the way, Nomura is somewhere in that journey, and we have not crossed the 3 year mark. The stakeholders are the next one, or the who, right? Which is very important. You really need to take the organization along in the journey, right? It's understanding who are your partners, right? Who do you have to educate? Who do you have to ensure that they get, they buy into your strategy story, they buy into making sure that they are ready for the change, and they then sort of permeate the change across the organization, right? Then the what comes in, which to me, or to us rather, are the four pillars, right? Which is readiness across your strategy. So if you've done a business case, you've done, some sort of at a very broad level, organization level, here's why we wanted the AI, here's what we want it to impact, and so on and so forth. But how do you then assess the readiness across that, right? The next part is culture, which is a huge component in success or failure, right? However you want to see it, right? And this is one piece that's often missing in many of the plans programs that I've come across. When people are sharing case studies and anecdotes around what did work or what worked. Technology, of course, is important, right? AI at the end of the day is an offering based on technologies. We can't forget that, and therefore, is the infrastructure ready? What sort of platforms do you need? What sort of services do you need, and so on and so forth, right? And then hand in hand with that is your processes, right? So one of the challenges that I have noticed, or we have collectively noticed, is there are a lot of AI solutions out there that are either being built or purchased or co-built and so on and so forth, but they're being put to replicate the process without rethinking the process, and that actually doesn't do a lot of benefit to either you or to the users of the AI technology in the organization. So you do really need to put a lot of focus on that. Final pillar is the how, and of course, to the room, I think we don't need to preach a lot about the how. This is where you actually formulate practical steps towards execution, right? This is something that a lot of organizations often, unfortunately, have started off with, right, without doing justice to the first three pillars. And I think if you were to start off again or to reset the journey a little bit, right, in your own organization, you really need to think about all four together, not something that you can just think of one in isolation of the other, right? And as I said earlier, right, this is the only one sort of key message that I would if anybody wants to carry it back into their organization, into their structures and so on and so forth, this is probably the one that I feel very strongly about. So let's then unpack into this a little bit, right? Again, remember, this is a primer. We can write papers about it. We can spend hours about these, each of these points. On the why, right? I've distilled it down to really these two things, right? There could be multiple other things that come to your mind, right? Of course, right? You would have to make a judgment call. But if you don't have these two, the others do not make sense a lot. The first one of that is you have to establish your strategic objectives for AI, right? What is it that you want to achieve? And this is not use case, right? This is essentially at an organization level, how does it tie to your core mission and vision, right? What do you want AI to do, right? For some organizations, it might be, hey, I would want it to create new revenue streams. For others, it might be, I want to make my process faster, better. For others, it might be, I want to enhance my customer satisfaction and service, and so on and so forth. But you really got to spend some time thinking about this, right? This is where you would actually define the rest of the AI journey, right? The second thing on the why is define principles once you have some objectives, right? The principles, as an example, could be how much of experimentation would you align, right? What's your build versus buy framework, right? What point do you want to take those decisions? What are the parameters for those decisions, right? In an organization as large as ours, right? Principles are around how much open source do we go versus, how much proprietary SaaS-based solutions or offerings do we procure, and so on and so forth. So there's a multiple there are multiple levels of confidence here, but again, right, it's important you put this in context of your own organizational appetite, right? So broadly, these are the two things that you need to talk about the why, right? Now, I'll come to an example in terms of how we executed, but this is where, in this specific, in the context of our organization, this is where we find the group AI strategy, the group AI framework, and policies and principles, right? So we've got all of that actually operational in each, and we spent almost 6 to 8 months defining that, right? Whether you believe it or not, even before we started building and rolling out services and so on and so forth at scale, right? It's not that we stopped for this to be completely aligned and signed off, but at the same time, we didn't, go all on for deploying solutions, right? We sort of took a very pragmatic approach to say we need to understand this. Only then we will start scaling up. Right. On the who, right? As mentioned earlier, right? It's all about a cross-functional journey. It's not about technology, right? So on who, you really need to identify who your key stakeholders are, what their roles and responsibilities are, right? Now, AI is an all-encompassing technology and solution, right? Whether you recognize or not, it does touch a variety of these functions, if not all of them at all times, right? So obviously, with the strategy, you do have your executive leadership buy-in and alignment. You would then need to, if some of the business units or functions are not part of your, executive leadership, you'd have to socialize that, understand what their needs are, bring them on board along the journey, because at the end of the day, they're all going to be your stakeholders and users of AI. They're the ones who are going to be actually providing you with, real world problems to solve for. So you really need to stay connected on the ground. Right? You've got taken data, right? I think that's self-explanatory in terms of, how your IT teams need to organize themselves, right? In order to service some of these newer components. How does the data teams, where they're separate from IT, how do they actually gear up to understand data management for AI? That's extending the practices that we already have, but more so going into managing unstructured data, semi-structured data together, along with the traditional structured data, where especially financial organizations and some of the bigger sectors like retail, pharma, etc., has always been very, very strong on. Right. On the other side of it, legal and compliance, right? They're a very, very important part of this, right? And an extension of that, in some organizations, you would have third-party risk or vendor management type of, divisions where they would need to be involved, right? The reason is simple, because now with legal and compliance, there are issues around privacy, for example. Right. There are things like, you need to perhaps even rethink your contracts, right? Because you no longer own the models in context of a generative AI, right? If you think about classical machine learning and, your olden days of, and I say olden because they came in first, not because they're obsolete, right? Of statistics models and stochastic models and so on, right? The organization owned the IP for those models. They own the training data in many cases and so on and so forth. With generative AI, the models are being provided by another provider, right? So who owns the risk? Who owns the model if something goes wrong, right? And where's the safeguard? Where's the legal safeguard? Do you actually have a right to audit an AWS or an Azure? Should you need to, and so on and so forth. And these need to be documented in legal, right? Especially if you're in a regulated industry like ours, right? If you're in Nomura, where we work with 30 different jurisdictions, right, in terms of regulators, right, compliance risk becomes really, really high. So, how do you then take the sort of common for all and drive, your solution so that you're not breaking any compliance and regulations across these jurisdictions? You'll need to bring your risk functions across, right? Whether it's operational risk, model risk, and other functions of risk, but primary op risk and your model risk needs to be aligned. Model risk has to be uplifted quite a bit in terms of their understanding of how generative AI models work, because some of the traditional measures may or may not be helpful, right? How do you rethink about thresholds for model upgrades and model changes, right? So these are very important parameters for you to consider, right? And each of these will need to be baked into your overall roadmap and planning. And this is the slide that makes it real in terms of when organizations say, hey, we have not really got the benefit, because a lot of times what you're seeing is one or the other department's not really bought into it, or they have realized there's an issue, and then they sort of have to raise the risk, or even if it's a highly sensitive one, maybe even have to pause the use case for a while, and so on and so forth. Right. You'll also have to work with your HR departments, because primarily to upskill your people, right? How to use the technology, right? When to use the technology, right? When to, apply your judgment, and so on and so forth. So in our case, right, we ran 2 sets of trainings. It's an ongoing basis, but we ran it before we actually went live with our biggest use case, was to train up all the control functions in terms of how they should understand AI and AI risks, and also all the developers and users in terms of, how can they develop, how can they integrate, what are the best practices, the do's and don'ts, and so on and so forth, right? So again, roll that out in part of your, your brown bag lunch sessions, your sort of L&D training portals, and, your town halls. You can probably refer them, and so on and so forth. So multiple ways to do it. We're not going to discuss that. But the point here being that, there's a range of activities that you need to think of with different stakeholders, and that's why the who becomes very critical. The what, I think this probably would resonate to a lot of you, because you probably are doing it, I'm sure, right? In terms of when there's a use case, there needs to be prioritization, right? There needs to be a roadmap. Now, the business alignment has to align with your first why, right? So if your focus for the first, let's say, 2 years is on productivity type of use cases, because you want to understand the technology, you want to understand whether it's really, beneficial before going into a customer-facing use case, you want to ensure that those are the ones. If those are the ones you're prioritizing. If your strategy is to augment revenue, right? You would want to go after those use cases, and then you want to define the ROIs, measures for those, right? How do you measure the returns, right? Are you measuring returns in terms of new signups, depending on the business, or are you measuring, augmented revenues? Are you your bank? Are you deepening the wallet, broadening the wallet, and so on and so forth? So you really need to sort of understand the use case, prioritize it, and then put the right people and tech and the operating model behind it. Culture, all right, very, very important in terms of how are you doing change management. This is often the biggest roadblock in adoption, right? This is where things like assurance or plans or addressing concerns such as work displacement, right? With the introduction of AI and so on and so forth, because whether we like it or not, that is a real concern. With our employees, right? And addressing that upfront and having a plan to say, hey, this is what we think about it, right? This is how we are making sure that we are going to upskill you, right? This is the new ways of working, and so on and so forth. That communication and the change management, taking them along, is going to go a long way in your in our AI adoption journey, right? Because it can be the best tech, right? Your management or your top board might be super committed. If your force on the ground, right, they are not bought into it, or they have a fear of that this might be an issue down the line for their own roles, etc., right? You will see resistance, and that's important to address and have a continuous dialogue with them, right? So putting in change management is non-negotiable. Of course, you have to rethink about the processes, right? Whether it's governance processes in terms of what's your risk appetite, what's your AI risk assessment process, for example, right? How much of a risk can you tolerate? What types of use cases are allowed, and so on and so forth, right? Are very, very important. So in our case, right, for example, we are now going through the motions of understanding how much of agency should we be allowing for agentic in the first year, right? Because we've already done experiments and research into the fact that the more agents you chain into a solution, right? Of course, the more the points of failure, the higher the risk. the chances of going wrong are higher, and so on and so forth, right? So how much of agency do you give, right? How many agents do you chain into a solution and things like that, right? Now, at a glance, that might be a technical problem, but it is not, right? So it is, again, you have to tie back to your, governance policies, your risk appetites, and, your organizational construct, right? Your operating model, right? In terms of ensuring that, the roles and responsibilities are really understood, and everybody is accountable for, what they're assigned, right? That's super important. Lastly, data and tech, right? Is your data ready? Obviously, now all organizations have talked about it for decades in terms of, data readiness, your usual measures of, data quality and so on and so forth, right? With generative AI, a lot of the focus has turned also into tapping into the unstructured data, right? So, do you actually have a strategy around that, right? In terms of managing your unstructured data, right? Or structuring it even, and so on and so forth, right? Do you have the infrastructure to do that, right? Are you going to have your own, are you an organization that needs to handle such very important and sensitive data that you have to then have your own infrastructure, etc., and so on and so forth, right? So again, well understood, I believe, right? The last part, the how, right? And we'll sort of wrap it with this. This is something, I think, a regular cycle of deployment, but again, right, this would have to be aligned to what you define, right? See how much of exploration and experimentation are allowing, right? What is your threshold to turn an experiment into a deployment that's good enough, and so on and so forth. So in our use case, in one of our use cases for research summarization, right, we did experiments for 3 rounds with 3 different cohorts of relationship managers to get different types of feedback, right? So and then after collectively agreeing, we then went into a production pilot deployment for 3 months before we scaled it up to the entire portfolio, right? We're now in the phase of measuring that in terms of how much productivity gains are we getting. Are we actually able to, recommend the right set of research articles to the relationship managers so that they can have meaningful conversations with their clients? Are we getting then returns out of those conversations? Meaning, are we then able to track whether they are actually leading into opportunities that are being recorded in the CRM system, and so on and so forth, right? And then, the cycle continues with you to improve that overall, returns and justify it, what's the enhancements required, and so on and so forth. Right? So I know I really rushed through it, some of it, but the intent of this, as I said earlier, right, was to walk you through in terms of the thought process around what can you do better in order to, get going in your AI adoption journey. I'm sure each of you have had experiments. Each of you have run multiple pilots in your organization. Some of you have moved forward from that. Some of you are probably thinking around it. But as you go along the journey, do consider some of the points that we've discussed. These are practical things that we have done. We've been really benefited by it. I would probably end there. I think we are out of time. Thank you so much again.
Thanks so much for the wonderful session, sir. I have a follow-up question. How do you stop AI from becoming a CEO passion project instead of a measurable business lever?
Sure. First slide. You make it part of your management vision and study, right? So it is no longer something that is on the side desk of side of your desk job. It is part of your company's mission vision, and you have got measurable targets against it. So essentially, right, if you remember let me go back to the slides, but if you recall the DBS story that I was referring to earlier, right, that was effectively announcing it publicly that we have now that they've announced, right? It is in their annual reports and they're going to track it year on year, right? So it is that level of commitment and the follow through of commitment that you really need to ensure with your management. So let me actually just quickly go through this. So these two blocks together would answer your question. So the why, which is why are we doing AI, right? That defines, that CEO mindset or the board's commitment to AI. And then the who will actually then make sure that you are accountable once it's the vision is set and the journey is, journey started.
Anyway.
Hope that answers.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. Good day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.